Do you use Excel to keep track of data for your company? If so, you're going to want to lean in because in this episode, we're going to talk about how using Excel brought a mid-8-figure business to the brink of ruin and the 5 Excel mistakes you want to avoid to make sure the same thing doesn't happen to your company. Starting with the first mistake, exchanging Excel files. A recent news article tells the story of the Williams Formula One racing team, once the top Formula One team in the world, and how using Excel the wrong way ultimately cost them tens of millions of dollars, sent them to the bottom of the standings, and almost spelled disaster for their future. The article says, the team reportedly didn't have a central resource that tracked what parts cost, how long they took to make, or even how many they had or where they were stored. This forced production staff to search for parts whose location hadn't been documented, wasting valuable time. One of the things the Williams team might have been doing is they might have been passing Excel files back and forth. So exchanging Excel files happens every day in companies all over the world. You take an Excel file, put some data in it, send it to your coworker. They might add some data, update some data, send it back to you, and that goes back and forth for a while. And if it ends there, you might be okay. However, what usually happens is ultimately you add people to that email distribution, you add data, and now you end up with multiple versions. Have you ever sent an Excel file to some coworkers and they each mark it up and send it back to you? And now you have a half dozen different versions of that Excel spreadsheet. What do you do with that? Well, the only thing you can do to get back to one spreadsheet is manually merge all of that data. And that's one way to give yourself a guaranteed headache. In the case of Williams Racing, they had 20,000 parts in their database. You can imagine what would have happened or what maybe happened if they were passing those Excel spreadsheets back and forth among several different people. That Excel file that they had critical information about each part that made up their car. They couldn't afford to have their data out of sync. There's a limited amount of time they have in the off season to prepare for the upcoming season, to build the new car, to revise the car that they currently have and improve it. If they had data that was out of sync, they would not meet any of those deadlines. What you really want in the case of this kind of critical data that supports your entire organization, you want what's called a single source of truth. What is a single source of truth? A single source of truth means having your data in one location. Your data lives in one location. It's only updated in that one location, meaning you have one version of that data. This gives you confidence that that data is accurate. And when you have that kind of confidence in your data, you can make good decisions for your business. Now, you may think, well, exchanging Excel files isn't a good idea. Passing them back and forth isn't a good idea. What if we just had one centralized Excel file? And that brings us to mistake number 2, having one centralized Excel file. If you have one centralized Excel file, does this give you a single source of truth? Well, the problem is Excel is not meant for concurrent use. That means it's not meant for multiple users to access the Excel file at the same time. Excel is a file at the end of the day, and 2 users cannot have the same file open and update that same file. Let's say you wanted to have a centralized Excel file. So you put an Excel file on a network drive and you share it out to all your users. The first problem you're going to run into are read-only issues. What that means is if one user opens the Excel file and another user tries to open that Excel file from that same network location, the second user is only going to be able to open a read-only version of that file. That's because Excel knows and the network knows that file is already open. So it's not going to allow the second user to write to that, to make updates to that file. Now maybe the first user opens the file, makes some updates, then closes it, and then the next user is able to access it. However, I've seen situations where one user will open a file and just forget about it. So many users nowadays have so many applications open on their computers at the same time that sometimes they just forget. And I've seen this happen with my clients where a user will open an Excel file, open some other kind of file, and just leave it open, and then no one else can access that file. In the case of an Excel file on the network drive, it has another problem. If you decide, well, I'm not going to wait for that other user to close the file, I'm just going to download the file so I can work with it locally. I'll make my updates locally. Now, once the first user closes out of that file eventually, and you then go and upload the file that you have updated, now what happens is you've overwritten any of their changes. And the problem with having one Excel file on a network share is that there is no change tracking. The first user's changes will be lost forever. The thing to remember about almost anything, software in particular, is if something can be used improperly, users will eventually use it improperly. Sometimes they just honestly don't know better. Now, worst case scenario, if you had to share an Excel file, worst case scenario, you could share it on a SharePoint or a Teams site. The reason you could do that is because this would allow you to track changes. If you have an Excel file, you upload it to a Teams site, which is really just SharePoint in the background. Multiple users can access that file, and multiple users can update the file. However, this should be a temporary solution only. This is not a long-term solution for storing data. The reason for that is, yes, it will allow you to track changes. You could recover any changes that were incorrectly overwritten. But the problem with using Excel on SharePoint or Teams is there are many quirks. The first thing to be aware of is if one person opens that file and sorts it or filters it, the second person who goes into that file is going to inherit the sorting or filtering of the first user. Now, let's say the second user then goes and changes the file, changes the sorting, changes the filtering, and then they leave and that first user comes back to the file. That first user is then going to see the filtering and sorting from the second user, not the original sorting and filtering they have. This gets very confusing to use the version of Excel that's on SharePoint or Teams. Another thing that can happen is that filtering can just stop working. I've seen this happen many times. We have an Excel file on Teams, you're using it on Teams, and all of a sudden the filters will just completely stop working. It doesn't matter how many times you check options on the filter or uncheck them, they don't work. I've even exited out of the Excel file in Teams and came back in, and the filters still wouldn't work. The only thing we could do is just wait until later. And that is a pain when you're trying to get stuff done. Another thing I've seen are glitches in Excel. So Teams will allow you to open the Excel file in your local copy of Excel. And every time one user did that, it wiped out all of the filters on the Teams version of Excel. Those are several reasons why this is only a temporary solution and not a good long-term solution for storing data in a central location. That brings us to mistake number 3, using Excel as a database. We've been talking about storing data in Excel. Excel is not a database, and therefore it should not be used as a database. In the case of Williams Racing, the news article goes on to say, you need to know where each one of those independent components are. These are the parts, the 20,000 parts that made up their car. You need to know where each of those independent components are, how long it will take before it's complete, how long it will take before it goes to inspection, if there's been any problems with inspections, whether it has to go back again. And once you start putting that level of complexity in, which is where modern Formula One is, the Excel spreadsheet falls over and humans fall over. And that's exactly where we are. That was the CEO talking about their Excel spreadsheet. So here's the thing. Excel is not designed for complex data. Now, in most cases, if you have Excel and you're storing data in it, it probably didn't start out complex. It probably started out as a very simple thing. Maybe a few lines of data, maybe a few columns. Even if you had a lot of lines of data, you probably only had a few columns. And then from there, it grew. Williams Excel spreadsheet grew so that they were tracking 20,000 parts. And not only 20,000 parts, but for each part, they were tracking the timeline, where it was in the production timeline. They were tracking how many of each part they had, whether they had any parts, and then they were also tracking the location of those parts in the warehouse. The problem with that level, that amount of data and that level of complexity is that, quite frankly, that is difficult to update. In Excel, it's difficult because you have to scroll over to find the column that you're trying to update. Then you have to scroll down and make sure you're on the right line. And a lot of times, if you're going based on a product number, the product number is put in the very leftmost column, which when you scroll over to the right, you can't see it. It's just very cumbersome to use. And what happens when something is cumbersome and difficult to use, some users just won't use it. And here's what happens then. If some users just don't want to face the frustration of updating the data in this cumbersome Excel spreadsheet, the data is not going to get updated. And that means you're then going to have bad data. Now let's put this in perspective. Williams' annual budget, every single year, their budget is $45 million. Excel is a low-cost piece of software, which most people have already. Almost every business in the world runs on Microsoft Office, now called Microsoft 365. So the truth is, Williams probably made zero investment for this solution to track the data, the critical data on all these parts. That was a completely inappropriate choice that ended up costing them tens of millions of dollars ultimately. If you have any sort of complexity to your data, that data needs to be stored a certain way. Firstly, it needs to be stored in normalized format. Normalized format essentially means data that doesn't repeat. In order to set up a normalized data structure, you need a relational data store, a relational database. Databases are relational. You can have multiple tables that are linked together, and each of those tables stores the appropriate information so that you don't have repetition of data. That makes it efficient to update. It also prevents errors, because if you're updating the same data in several different locations, like you probably would have to do with an Excel spreadsheet, eventually you're going to start missing some of that. And those issues will compound. Those errors will compound over time. And eventually you're going to have a spreadsheet that is just a bunch of garbage data. The other thing about complex data is you want to be able to access it and update it quickly, easily, and most importantly, concurrently. You want to be able to have multiple users to be able to access that data at the same time. The problem with Excel is that only one person can access that file at the same time. In the case of a database, many users can access that at the same time, and the database will manage who is accessing what pieces of data and make sure that there aren't conflicts happening. And here's the bottom line. Companies do not rise to the level of their goals. They will fall to the level of their systems. And in the case of Williams Racing, they had a poor choice for a system to store their data, and that's what caused them to fall so much in the rankings and basically go from first to worst in Formula One racing. Now, mistake number 4 is using Excel if you need to scale or grow, if your company needs to grow. News article went on to say that the convoluted parts database may have contributed to the team showing up late for preseason testing in 2019. It also played a role in Williams' weak in-season development, apparently ballooning the cost of the team's mid-2023 upgrade to extraordinary levels. What Williams had to do in 2023 is they had to upgrade their data storage. They had to upgrade their technical solution for tracking their data. And this is a classic case of technical debt. Technical debt essentially means incurring a large expenditure in the future because you decided to take the cheap solution now. Basically, pay now or pay a lot more later. Any solution you use to store your data must be able to grow with your business. Now, by design, Excel cannot grow past a certain point. It has built-in limits. Microsoft built limits into Excel. It cannot hold more than a certain amount of data. There's an example just a few years ago in the British government where they were unaware of the limitations of Excel and they were tracking COVID cases in an Excel file. Unaware of the limitations of Excel, they ended up missing, because the data just fell off because it was outside the limits of the file. They ended up missing 50,000 COVID cases. They missed tracking those cases. Think of how many lives were put in danger by that reliance on Excel. Thing about Excel is, even though it does have those limits, it gets unusable way before hitting those limits. Excel, the more and more data you start adding, the more columns you start adding, the more rows you start adding, at some point, it will become sluggish. Sluggish to use, sluggish to update, sluggish to search, sluggish to replace data that needs to be replaced. It's just a poor solution, and it's not going to allow your business to scale. And again, coming back to that issue of, if something has a lot of friction when someone tries to use it, eventually they just won't use it. And you're going to end up in the same situation with data that isn't updated and basically a spreadsheet full of garbage data. And mistake number 5, using Excel for sensitive data. Every company in the world has sensitive data, has proprietary information that they want to keep within the company so that it doesn't get out to the competition. Now, Williams Racing has about 1,000 employees. Any company that has that many employees is going to eventually have employee turnover. What if their parts database, what if all the critical information about their parts that make up their cars that they use to compete in these races that sometimes are won by fractions of a second, what if that information leaked out to their competitors? Excel cannot prevent access to that data. Excel is a file. A file is something that someone can just take with them if they want. If someone has access to that Excel file, to that Excel spreadsheet, they have the data. There's no way to prevent them from having that data, from taking that data wherever they want. It's just a file. Excel file is portable. It's copyable. It's shareable. Very easy for that data to leak out. On the other hand, a true database has extensive permissions to protect the data that's stored within it. There are permissions at the database level. You can prevent people from even accessing the entire database. There are permissions at the table level. You can allow people into the database, but prevent them from seeing certain tables in the database. There are even permissions at the row level. You could allow someone into the database, you could allow someone into a certain table in that database, but then you could prevent them from seeing certain rows of data in that database table. And when you're using a database, you can even add on top of that a layer of software that could give you even more specific control over the data, even more granular control. Excel cannot protect data that way, and that's why it's a poor choice for storing any sort of data in your organization, because at some point that data is proprietary to the way your business works, to the way your business runs. It's important to keep it protected from any sort of competition or leaking out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.